Sometimes, too, they talked of engaging in active rebellion against the party, but with no notion of how to take the first step. Even if the fabulous brotherhood was a reality, there still remained the difficulty of finding one's way into it. He told her of the strange intimacy that existed, or seemed to exist, between himself and O'Brien, and of the impulse he sometimes felt simply to walk into O'Brien's presence, announce that he was the enemy of the party, and demand his help. Curiously enough, that does not strike her as an impossibly rash thing to do. She was used to judging people by their faces, and it seemed natural to her that Winston should believe O'Brien to be trustworthy on the strength of a single flash of the eyes. Moreover, she took it for granted that everyone, or nearly everyone, secretly hated the party and would break the rules if he thought it safe to do so. But she refused to believe that widespread organized opposition existed or could exist. The tales about Goldstein and his underground army, she said, were simply a lot of rubbish which the party had invented for its own purposes and which you had to pretend to believe in. Times beyond number, at party rallies and spontaneous demonstrations, she had shouted at the top of her voice for the execution of people whose names she had never heard and in whose supposed crimes she had not the faintest belief. When public trials were happening, she had taken her place in the detachments from the Youth League who surrounded the courts from morning to night, chanting at intervals, "Death to the traitors!" During the 2 minutes hate, she always excelled all others in shouting insults at Goldstein, yet she had only the dimmest idea of who Goldstein was and what doctrines he was supposed to represent. She had grown up since the Revolution and was too young to remember the ideological battles of the 50s and 60s. So remember, Winston was around during that time, so he does remember these battles, or he faintly remembers them. She was not around, so she doesn't know who really Goldstein is. She just knows that she's supposed to hate him, so she does. But Winston has a more solid understanding of who Goldstein actually was as a person. To Julia, he's just kind of an idea. He's just kind of something that the party said you have to believe in. Winston actually knows who he is and maybe actually saw his picture, but Julia doesn't really know who that is. So does this really matter to her that much? Such a thing as an independent political movement was outside her imagination, and in any case, the party was invincible. It would always exist, and it would always be the same. You could only rebel against it by secret disobedience, or, at most, by isolated acts of violence, such as killing somebody or blowing something up. In some ways, she was far more acute than Winston and far less susceptible to party propaganda. Is she far less susceptible to party propaganda? I would say no. I think Winston thinks that she is far less susceptible, but we have to realize that she is still a part of the party and still grew up in the party, so she is still susceptible to the propaganda. She is part of the propaganda, whether she likes it or not, and whether Winston likes it or not. So watch out for that. Once, when he happened in some connection to mention the war against Eurasia, she startled him by casually saying that in her opinion, the war was not happening. The rocket bombs which fell daily in Lenin were probably fired by the government of Oceania itself, just to keep people frightened. This was an idea that had literally never occurred to him. She also stirred a sort of envy in him by telling him that during the 2 minutes hate, her great difficulty was to avoid bursting out laughing. But she only questions the teachings of the party when they in some way touched upon her own life. Often she was ready to accept the official mythology simply because the difference between truth and falsehood did not seem important to her. Do you see that? That's part of the propaganda. The party doesn't want you to care about whether things are true or not because they control everything. And just by him saying, yeah, Julia really doesn't care about what's true or not, she just kind of goes along with it, is part of that propaganda. And I think it's really important that we understand that in terms of her character and in terms of his character, right? We need to know that. She believed, for instance, having learned it at school, that the party had invented airplanes. In his own school days, Winston remembered in the late 50s it was only the helicopter that the party claimed to have invented. A dozen years later, when Julia was at school, it was already claiming the airplane. 1 generation more, and it would be claiming the steam engine. And when he told her that airplanes had been in existence before he was born and long before the Revolution, the fact struck her as totally uninteresting. After all, what did it matter who had invented airplanes? It was rather more of a shock to him when he discovered from some chance remark that she did not remember that Oceania, 4 years ago, had been at war with East Asia and at war with Eurasia. these are facts that Winston really holds on to, right? Because he knows that these memories are really the only thing that's keeping the truth and keeping facts. But to find out that Julia doesn't remember, or maybe she doesn't care and just kind of dismissed it, how do you think that would affect their relationship? These are things that are really important to him and that she doesn't seem to find any important. So how do you think that would make Winston feel about her, right? He might have some conflicting feelings. That's something to think about. It was true that she regarded the whole war as a sham, but apparently she had not even noticed that the name of the enemy had changed. I thought we'd always been at war with Eurasia, she said vaguely. It frightened him a little. The invention of airplanes dated from long before her birth, but the switchover in the war had happened only 4 years ago, well after she was grown up. He argued with her about it for perhaps a quarter of an hour. In the end, he succeeded in forcing her memory back until she did dimly recall that at one time East Asia, and not Eurasia, had been the enemy. But the issue still struck her as unimportant. Who cares? She said impatiently. It's always one bloody war after another, and one knows the news is all lies anyway. Sometimes he talked to her of the records department and impudent forgeries that he committed there. Such things did not appear to horrify her. She did not feel the abyss opening beneath her feet at the thought of lies becoming truths. He told her the story of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. Do you remember he had that picture? And then we read about a memory when he had a picture of these guys, and that was the only solid evidence that he had. The party was changing the history because they made a statement when they were on trial, and they said, yeah, we were consorting with the enemy on this date. And then he pulled this picture, and on the date that they had said they were on enemy soil was the date in the picture, and they were like part of the party. Do you remember that? That's important, and he thinks that's really important. And he also, I think, maybe feels a little bit guilty about it because you remember he at the time was still more with the party and what they were doing, and he wasn't as unorthodox as he is now, so he actually burned it. So that's a moment that he lost to kind of keep that evidence, and I think he really feels a lot of guilt for that because he didn't keep it. And so that moment is really important to him, and that's why he brought it up in that memory a long time ago. So he told her the story of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford and the momentous slip of paper which he had once held between his fingers. It did not make much impression on her. At first, indeed, she failed to grasp the point of the story. Were they friends of yours? She said. No, I never knew them. They were inner party members. Besides, they were far older men than I was. They belonged to the old days before the Revolution. I barely knew them by sight. Then what was there to worry about? People are being killed off all the time, aren't they? He tried to make her understand. This was an exceptional case. It wasn't just a question of somebody being killed. Do you realize that the past, starting from yesterday, had been actually abolished? If it survives anywhere, it's in a few solid objects with no words attached to them, like that lump of glass there. Already we know almost literally nothing about the Revolution and the years before the Revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it, even if I did the falsification myself. Because remember, that's his job, is to falsify information. After the thing is done, no evidence ever remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind, and I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. Just in that one instance, in my whole life, I did possess actual concrete evidence after the fact, years after it. So we had a discussion about Winston kind of going down a rabbit hole and kind of being like, well, maybe I'm crazy, maybe they're not crazy, maybe I'm crazy, because we talked about if you're in a room with a bunch of people and you know, because you, like, this was true yesterday, that 2 + 2 = 4, and you believe that, and you're like, oh yeah, you know, you're talking to people, oh yeah, 2 + 2 = 4, blah, 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 all this stuff, and then everybody that you talk to is like, no, 2 + 2 = 5, it's always equal 5, I don't know what you're talking about. You might start to go a little bit crazy because you're like, wait a minute, I know this, I know it in my heart that 2 + 2 = 4, But why is everybody saying 2 + 2 = 5? Like, am I wrong? You start to doubt yourself. You doubt your own memories. You doubt that what you know is true. And so Winston needs to confirm his memories with other people because he feels like he's going crazy. He's like, oh my gosh, I swear that this thing happened. And the fact that Julia is not as insistent as he is about recognizing the truth and recognizing the memories is having a big effect, I think, on their relationship, which we can talk about more. But he's just like so angry that she can't remember because he's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm going crazy all the time because I have these memories and nobody else has these memories. I had this piece of evidence and I think it's really important, but I destroyed it. And she's just like, yeah, so? She didn't get it. She doesn't get why it's so important to him. Okay, ready? And what good was that? That's Julia. It was no good because I threw it away a few minutes later, but if the same thing happened today, I should keep it. Well, I wouldn't, said Julia. I'm quite ready to take risks, but only for something worthwhile, not for bits of old newspaper. What could you have done with it even if you had kept it? Not much, perhaps, but it was evidence. It might have planted a few doubts here and there, supposing that I dared to show to anybody. I don't imagine that we can alter anything in our own timeline, but one can imagine little knots of resistance springing up here and there, small groups of people banding themselves together and gradually growing, and even leaving a few records behind so that the new generation can carry on where we left off.